Hello friends and welcome back. Today we will learn about the basics of CSS. So I have my HTML file open, I have live server running, and I'm zoomed in here 200%. If you are not familiar with any of this, the HTML and my setup, I have two videos that are linked in the description explaining all about HTML and forms and fundamentals basically. So let's just dig in. What is CSS? It stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and as the name suggests, it is in charge of styling our HTML document, which is by default is translated by the browser, whichever browser we use. So let's see how we can actually apply our own CSS. There are three ways we can implement CSS within our HTML document. The first one is called inline CSS, and it is done on the element itself. So for example, I have this h1, I will use the style attribute on the element, and I would use a property that I want to affect and then say the value for that property. In this case, I want to say the color of this text should be red. There we go. And then I end that declaration with a semicolon so that I can provide another property. For example, background should be green, yellow, that color, for example. There we go. And again, I can provide as many property and values as I want for this one element. The problem with inline CSS is that it can get very repetitive, as you can see here. If I have multiple elements on my page using the same style, I'm just repeating myself. But even if I want to make a change, it's even harder because I have to go and change these one by one. So inline CSS as a pure CSS or vanilla CSS is not recommended. And the reason I'm saying vanilla CSS is not recommended because I personally use framework CSS like Tailwind, which is actually inline, but that's different. So anywho, that is inline CSS, and you can see how we can implement it. This is not a good practice, of course. The better practice would be using a style element, so not the attribute, a style element within the head tag, and then target the HTML elements within the body in that element. So how do we do it? So I have this image, and this is the CSS syntax. We would need a selector. There are a lot of selectors that we can choose from and we can use. The simplest one is just to call an element by its tag name, like this one, h1. And then we have an open and closing curly brackets. We have the property column value semicolon, just like we saw in the inline CSS. And this is a declaration. So one selector or one element can have many declarations, and one property can have many values. Let's see it in example. So I'm going to target my h1 again. So open and close curly brackets. And I'm going to say the color should be white. Of course, we can't see it now. I'm going to say the background should be black, right? And now, just to show you what I mean by property and multiple values, for example, I want to say the border, I want to provide a border for this. So this border actually takes multiple values. And I can say the border should have a thickness of 10 pixel, for example, px short for pixel. It should be solid, and I will explain these once again. And the color of the border should be, let's say, yellow, just to show where we're working on. There we go. So this is the one way to provide a border. So there are properties in CSS where you can provide them one by one as a separate property values, or like this. This is called a shorthand for border. So basically, I can say border, you see width, 10 pixel, okay, border, which is called style. I can say dash dotted, let's say dotted, okay, and then border color, yellow, And I'm going to comment this out. In order to comment something out in CSS, we can press Control, if you are using VS Code, Control slash, oh sorry, because I'm on HTML it doesn't work, but basically you wrap it with a slash star and end it star slash. So wrap what you want to comment with this syntax. So beginning slash star and end it with star slash. So now you can see the width is 10 pixel. These dots, it's dotted. If I can say dashed, see what happens. These are the style and then the color. Instead of saying using these three value properties, kind of three lines, I can just use this. This is a shorthand. So if I change this to solid, which is exactly like this, so these three lines can be just used as one line like here. So I'm going to delete this comment. There we go. And it's back to what it was. So this is a shorthand property, which is quite useful. It's a shorthand property for setting border width, style, and color. There we go. VS Code is really nice because it helps you in many, many ways. So this is called internal CSS, and you can see it's quite useful, and you can target as many elements as you want. The problem, again, it also has a problem because as we have more elements, we would have more style, and our HTML document would get longer and longer. And also, let's say you have multiple pages that would want to use the same CSS or the same style, then you have to copy paste this in every page. So we would use external CSS, which is the best practice, and I will explain it uh, just in a moment. For now, we are going to stick with internal so we can see our HTML and CSS on the same page, so I don't have to switch back and forth. So let's talk about selectors just a bit. I'm going to create another element here just so I have multiple elements on my page. So maybe a link, and what else? I think that's enough for now. That's all I want, right? Maybe an h2 as well. H2 that says subheading. Okay, so this we already learned that the most basic selector is calling an element by its tag name. It is quite nice if you want to use the same style for the multiple elements that are of the same tag. So if I have another h1 here, you see it will actually be the same, and it doesn't matter where they are in the page, on the page, it would follow this style, right? So that's one way to look at it. However, let's say I have one h2 up there and another h2 here that says link to website, for example, which is this is the link. Okay, now I want to style my subheading that is called h2 and say the color, text color, should be same like blue. All right, I don't want this one. This is a link, so I'm targeting the h2, which is this one too, but I don't want this one. So there are multiple ways to isolate the subheading in this case. The first way is to use an ID. Let's say, I'm sorry, let's say I have only one subheading in my document. We can use ID if there is something unique. So if you have multiple subheadings, you wouldn't use ID. But let's say I have one. So I'm going to call it subheading, just like that, and copy it. Now I'm going to go up here, delete this one. Actually, I'm just going to delete the name. So I'm going to call the subheading should be color blue. Right now, this doesn't work, of course, because CSS doesn't know what is subheading. We want to say subheading is an ID of an element, and to do so, we provide a pound sign just before the name. And now, it will only look for the element with the ID of subheading. Right now, it doesn't care what kind of an element this is. It could be h3, it could be h6, it could be anything. This would be still the same. So again, the ID is nice if there is only one unique item, because as you know, ID is a unique identifier. You cannot have multiple elements with the same ID on your page. Now let's say you actually want to have subheadings. So these H2 are your subheadings. So you want them to follow the same style. The better practice would be to use a class instead of an ID. And this is actually the best practice. So when you work with CSS, you always or mostly you use class attribute on your elements and then provide a name, and then you target that name in your CSS. Right now, again, CSS doesn't know how to target the class. We can tell by providing a dot before it. So ID, remember ID was, let's say, main title color green. So I'm gonna give the ID of main title to my H1 because that is the main title. There we go, the color is green. And then the class of subheading. So the class of subheading to my subheadings, so two of them. The cool thing about class is that you can apply it to as many elements as you want, regardless of what they are. You can see this is blue now, this is blue, everything is blue. So, and also you can have actually multiple classes for one element. So this is subheading and then active, for example. And then I come here and say active, oops, I thought there is autocomplete, active background should be something light color. There we go. I'm gonna make it darker so we can see. Okay, and don't worry about these values, I'll explain. So you can see here we have two subheadings now. Both of them say the color should be blue. However, this one says it also is active, so the color of the background should be this background color. This is very useful in cases, for example, you have an input field and you say when the user clicks on it, the background should be different or the font should be different, or when it is inactive or disabled. So these are done by other ways of selecting the elements, which is too soon to talk about it. But what I want to show you is that you can have multiple classes for one element. So far we learned about inline CSS, internal CSS, and the selectors. So by tag name, by ID, and by class attribute. There is also another simple selector, which is a star. And basically, I think it's clear, it's a universal selector. I want to say the font family, so the font of every text on my page should be one of these. Let's see this one. So universal selector, as the name suggests, it selects everything on the page, literally everything in the body, and it applies that style to all. Now, let me show you something. So I'm going to provide a style attribute or inline CSS for this H2, so link to this website text, and I'm going to say the color should be, what color didn't we use? Orange. Orange, there we go. All right, so you see what happened. We are saying the class of subheading, which is this item, should have a color of blue. However, now it's orange. This is because something called a specificity. I am not comfortable to say that word, but here, W3 schools, and we go here on this category, it says CSS specificity. So many I's and S's. There's a table here that talks about the priority of CSS selectors, and they each have a value, and the higher value means they are in a higher, they have a higher priority. So there's a hierarchy of priority. So CSS, inline CSS, you can see has the highest value. That means it overrides any other style that is done through these other selectors. You can see universal has 0, so it's almost nothing. If there is something within these, selectors that talks about font family, it will override this one. And as well as ID, it has a 100, so ID is higher than the class, and then element is 1, and then we have all these other ones. I would not suggest to rely on this one because it can be very confusing, and you might lose track of it, because again, it would not be as simple as this few lines. It would be thousands of lines of code, and you have to look for it why some elements are not working the way they should. So don't rely on the hierarchy, but it's good to know it's there. So, and that's why, for example, this subheading is being ignored and this color is overwriting that blue color. We can have the same thing for this main title, which is the ID, right? So if I give it a class of, right now we're saying the color should be green, right? But if I give it the class of subheading, which says the color should be blue, it doesn't work. Because again, the ID has a higher priority than the class. So that is called, again, the specificity. Nice word. There is another one in this category of simple selectors, which is grouping items. Let's say I want to group my H2 and my A elements and give them a letter spacing. It's very clear what it does. 10 pixel. So it gives space between the letters of 10 pixel. So this is a nice way to group items or elements on your document, just to use less style for repeating yourself, just to avoid repeating yourself. So this is internal CSS, and these are the simple selectors. Now let's jump to external CSS. You can see this is already getting quite long, and you have to go up and down in your page, and it's kind of confusing and annoying. The best practice for a CSS, implementation of CSS, is to use a link element that basically that asks for a relationship. In this case, we say it says style sheet, right? And it asks for the source of it, because much like the A tag, it says, where is this? It could be an external link, but we don't have external for now. We don't have it on other servers or other websites, but we can create a file here and just call it main.css, for example, and then say here in the HTML, say this is in the same folder and it's called main.css. What I'm going to do, I'm going to cut all of this and put them in there, save it, save this one. You see nothing happens because now it's reading it from that file. So I'm going to delete all of this and just keep the h1. I'm going to delete the class and ID. I don't want it anymore. I'm going to go to main.css, delete all of this, keep the h1. I'm going to format my document. Now I have this one. So right now we can see we have just an h1, and it says the color, the background, and the border, and the font family, which is a universal property. But you can see here, actually, let me inspect this side. You can see there is a space between the edge and my item, my element. This is because the default style that is applied to the body, and you can see margin 8 pixel by the browser. I didn't provide this one, but they did it. I guess the browser does it by itself, by default. This is why usually when you work with CSS, you provide a CSS reset on your page. Usually you would come and say padding, which is this one. I will explain these. Should be 0, and then margin should be also 0. You can see that gap is gone, so now you can provide your own padding and margin and not rely on the default one. So let me explain this box with another box maybe on the page. So I'm gonna create a div here and give it an ID of box. It's just so we can talk about it. Right now we can't see it because there is no content. I can say box should have a width of 150 pixel, or maybe 100 just to keep it simple. Height of 100 pixel, and padding should be 20 pixel, margin 20 pixel. Again, I will explain, don't worry. Border should be, we already know the border, so I'm gonna say 10. I'm gonna copy this one. All right, yellow. I'm gonna give it a background of green. This yellow, I don't like it. There we go. I'm not very good at choosing colors either. Anyway, so we have the box now. So let's see on our browser, how is this box shown? So we know what we have because we can see the values, property values here. Let's select it and go down here. It's given us 100, right? The width and height. We give a 220 padding. We have 100 border, a 10 pixel border, and 20 pixel margin. So let me explain these ones first. Width and heights are quite, it's just obvious what they are. It's the width and height. Padding is the space between the content and the border within the box. So the border, again, is this red border you can see. The padding is inside. Let me actually add a content here, say hello. Okay, and you can see that this hello doesn't go all the way to the edge because we provided the padding. So padding is inside of the box, the space between the border and the content. Margin is outside of the border, so the space between the border and the rest of the parent. So whatever the parent of this box is. In this case, it's the body. So margin outside, padding inside, okay? And border, of course, is the border on the line. So here's the problem though. In CSS sometimes can be weird. So you can see here, the width is 100, right? And 20 padding and 10 is the border. Forget the margin for now. There is a property and value that we use it on CSS reset all the time. It's called box sizing, and we provide the value of border box. Watch what happens to this blue box when I save it. Bam. It got smaller, and look at the values now. It's 40, 20, 10. Again, the padding is 20, of course, we gave it a 20. The border is 10, of course it's 10. But why did the width go down to 40? It is because by default, if we don't provide this, commenting it out, the width and the height of an element is calculating by adding padding and border. So therefore, when you say, I want my box have a width of 100 and the padding of 20 of a border of 10, CSS says, well, okay, I'll give you 130 of width and 130 of height. So that can ruin your design because you want 100. That's your limit. So we provide that one to include these two, not the margin again. I'm going to put margin down here. So these two values within the width and height. There we go. Does it make sense? Because here now we have 40 on the width, right? 20 on each side and then 10 on each side. So that will add up to 100. So 20, 40, 40. Does it make sense? And I hope it does. So that's why you always provide box sizing, border box for your designs, because otherwise it would be confusing and the width will be calculated some otherwise. Okay, so let's talk about one of the other important properties, and that is display. I'm going to keep the box there. Right now we see this display block on the div, which is this box. Display is a very kind of important property, and it says how an item should be, an element should be displayed on the page. By default, elements have different displays. For example, this, let me provide an A tag under my H tag that says link. So, and let's go here and say the A tag should have a background of gold. What did I do here? BG gold. There we go. Let me give it margin No, I don't want to give it margin for now. So you can see this one goes across, right? But this one doesn't. And in fact, if I don't provide a width for this one, just going to comment the width out, this one goes across too. This white space is because of the margin. This is because the display block, as the name suggests, it goes across the page. It's a block of element. Okay. However, some elements like this A tag are in line. So basically this A element has this property, display in line, display block. That H1 is like this. Now, sometimes you want to change it. You want to say that my A tag should go all the way across. So you can say display block. There we go. So again, there are a lot of properties and values in CSS, and the video can go for hours and hours if I want to cover all of them, and it can get overwhelming, but you don't really need all of them. All right, let me remove this one. Let me remove this one and the box itself. I'm going to actually create a menu just above the H1, and I'm gonna delete the CSS for H1 too, and so we can have more practice just by actually creating a menu. So I would have a nav element, which is shortboard navigation, and within that I would have an A tag which will contain my image logo. The source of it is in my folder images, and the width should be 50. So this is, I use an A tag so that I can click on it and go to the home page, for example. So right now it doesn't go anywhere. And then within that nav, I want to have another div wrapper, have my menu items in there. For example, I want to use A links for them and say, for example, about, contact, and one more, just say, for example, services. All right, like this. Okay, and keep in mind, you see already my image is up there, and then there's nothing, and then the next line starts with this div because div is a block element, A is not a block element. So this would be one line. But these A tags actually go next to each other because they are in line instead of going under each other. So because, again, I said it's a good practice to give classes to these items, I'm going to give the class of navbar. It's not necessary in this case, but I'm going to do it just for practice. Navbar, and I'm going to come here and select that navbar and give it a background. A good practice with working with CSS, when you're working on elements, the first thing you give it a background so you know where is your boundary, you know, where you're working on. So the first thing I want to do is to make these items, the children, which is this div and this A, right? These don't count as the children of nav because they are within the div. So this nav has two children, one A and one div. I want them to go across from each other on the same line instead of going underneath. There is a very nice property and it's called display flex. Display flex or CSS flex is very powerful and it can have its own video, but what it does, it would make the element very flexible. So the items within it become very flexible to move around left and right, up and down. So now I want to say, first of all, on the y-axis, right, vertically, they should align items vertically center. So we can use the property align items, which is part of the flex display. This would not work without flex, okay? And I want them to be centered. And then I want them to be across from each other. Remember, this is one element, my logo, and these three items are one element together. There is another property called justify content. And this one says, okay, how do you want to justify your content on the x-axis? So horizontally, I want them to be center. Well, that's not quite what I want. I want them to be the space, take their space and push him aside. So a space between. If I say a space evenly, this is quite nice too, because it will take this space and separates it evenly. So again, a display flex is very powerful and it can has its own video. You can see under my logo, there's a bit of a space, right? This is because we are using a tag, and a tag has its own properties. So what we can do, for example, reset that one too. For example, I know one of them is text decoration that I don't want any. So this doesn't work because there is no, it's actually, you can see, just, what did I do? Sorry. Let me comment this out again. You see these lines? This is called text decorations, right? Now I don't want that for my links. I will provide my own CSS, so I say text decoration none, and they're gone. Now, the reason of this space thing up there, down there, is because this a tag is, let me show you. Again, remember, we can give it a background to see where we're working on, black. You see, the a tag is actually stretching all the way, right? And it is centered because we said centered, but the image within the a tag is not centered. So we could go ahead and say, for example, display flex, align items, center again. And you can see what happens. This will center the image, but it does that to my other a tags too. But I don't want to keep it. For now, I'm going to keep it just simple. I will address that later. But let's continue with our navbar. So right now, they are very close. They're stuck to the edges. I don't want that. Remember, to provide a space within the box, we use padding. And I'm going to say padding of 15 pixel all around. That's all right. So, but here's I want to show you something else. I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going to say padding top 15 pixel, padding. I'm going to copy it 4 times. I'm going to say right, bottom. I will explain it. Just let me type it, and left. Okay. So you see we have padding top. It's clear top. Padding on this image, padding top, right. Let me select it. Top, right, bottom, left. It goes clockwise. Now, this is called a shorthand. Remember, we talked about this in the border. When we talked about the border, it's the shorthand for padding. We don't have to provide all these four values or properties. We can just have a shorthand, and then within that, we can have multiple values. So I want to say top 15, right 30, bottom 10, and left 5 pixel. It goes clockwise again. So if I select this one again, you can see 15, 30, 10, 5. So it's a lot better already. You can, but this is of course kind of, why would I want that? Unless there's something specific. So if I provide 4 values, it goes clockwise. If I provide 2 values, it goes top and bottom, left and right. You can see here. If I provide 1 value, it goes all around. So this applies to padding, to margin, and some other values. Okay, now let's talk about the items within the navbar. So I have this a tag, which is my image in it. So I'm gonna say a like before, and I'm gonna give it a background of black. So there we go. But these are black too. One of the things I didn't mention, which we kind of, because I want to keep it simple, there are other selectors. Like I said, there are many selectors. So going back to W3 schools, we only covered the simple selectors. There is also combinators, pseudo selectors, attribute selectors, and so on. But they can have their own video because there's quite a lot of them. One of the good ones is combinator selectors, and this one, the descendant selector, which basically means children parent selector kind of thing. So right now, I want to only select this a tag, which is within my navbar, okay, not within the div. All right. So if I come out, I'm going to stay on this table for a second. If I say, I can say, for example, go to the navbar with a space, right? This is basically saying, go to the parent, select the child, which is A. If I save it, nothing gonna happen because we are still inside. These A tags are still inside the nav parent, even though they are not the direct children of nav, but they are inside. So there is actually a combinator for that. You want to say that the direct child of the nav, right? So let's go here. We have this that says select the element where the parent is a div. So here I want to say, instead of a space, I will provide that greater sign. I want to say if the parent, this is like a condition, if the parent is a nav bar, select, and background should be black. If it's not, don't do anything. See, here the parent is a div. It's not class of navbar. If I provide this class actually to it, it will again work, but I don't want it. This is exactly what I want, just the first one. Now, again, I can say display flex and justify align item centers to make it like that. So you see that kind of that tiny little thing goes away. You know, in CSS, very little values can ruin your design, so you got to be careful of those. Anywho, so what I want to do, I want to remove that background. I want to give this a border radius. So I want to give it soft edges. Border radius, very much like padding and margin, except it's a shorthand. So you can actually say, for example, 30 pixel, 10 pixel, 15 pixel. For some reason, maybe you want to do this, 150 pixel. And I'm sorry, this has to be applied on my image. Just to keep it simple, I want to show you this one and then I'll explain. Just a second. So you can see what happens. This is it's actually quite nice. You know, you can kind of come up with crazy designs. So the reason it didn't apply on the A tag, because the image goes beyond it, right? So let me do this. Let me put it back on the A. Right now, I'm saying the A, which is this one, the A tag, should have a border. However, the image is going beyond those borders or those boundaries. There are two ways. I can either target my image and give it the border radius, or I can say overflow hidden, which means if something goes out of the boundaries of my A tag, just hide it. That's the result. Now, I'm gonna, this is kind of crazy. So I'm gonna just give it a 10 pixel all around. Again, remember, it goes all around. So it starts from top left, top right, bottom right, bottom left. It goes like that. So you can play with these numbers and just see which one, you know, works for you. It really, you know, it can come up, you can come up with really nice designs. I like this one, for example, just to keep it that way. So this one goes, you see, top left and bottom right, and then 25 on top right and bottom left. Anywho, so this is my logo. I'm satisfied with my logo. Now let's talk about these items here. So remember, these are within a div. So again, I can use one of those combinators to be a specific. Instead of saying div, I want to say go inside the navbar and then take that div. Now here, I don't need this if anymore because there is only one div within my nav. So I'm saying the child div within the navbar. And then what do I want to do? So first, I want to change the color to white. Ooh, what do I do? White. Okay, sorry. Again, this doesn't work because I'm not targeting the A. So I want to say the div and then the A. So I'm going 3 levels down, right? I'm saying the nav bar and go inside the div and then select the A's and give them the color of white, so the text color. And they're quite big, so I want to the font size should be 12 pixel, for example, maybe too small, 14 pixel. You can play with these units. I will explain the units as we get to the end of this video. So one way to separate these First of all, let's give it a background, see what we're working with. So there is a bit of a space, but it's not enough. Remember, you could give the margin, right? And say, I don't know, 10 pixel. That goes all around. So it means it will ruin the space between between the edge of the screen and the first item on the right. So I don't want this actually. I want only on the left. So I can say left, margin left. There we go. So it will only apply to the left of the items. That's one way to do it. And the other way would be actually using the flex again if you want to. But this is really preference how to use it, because there are many ways to achieve the same result with CSS. But I'm going to keep it simple as this because I want to use other values rather than just flex. I used it already 2 times. So now the clickable area is the text, right? And it's quite annoying. We want the clickable area to be bigger. So remember, for that we need padding. Now this one can go all around, right? I'm going to give it 5 pixel all around. So now it's bigger. It's a lot better. The user has more room to click, right? And also give it a border radius, just like the image, of 5 pixels. So it's a nice round kind of a button. And then what else do we need? I think it's time to get rid of this red background because that was just so we know what we're working on. Now, for example, let's say there is a big paragraph, so the user wants to scroll. Lorem 1000 words. There we go. If I scroll now, you see the menu is gone, right? We can actually make the menu sticky. So we need to target, where is the element? Let's go up, 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 up. The nav itself, so nav bar. We can provide position. So by default is relative. Position, it says the position CSS property says how an element is positioned in the document. It's quite self-explanatory. There is a value that's called sticky. And again, it pretty much says what it does. But if you just provide this one, nothing's going to happen because this one says, okay, where should I stick? You want to say the top of this should be 0. Now, again, it goes clockwise. It's just a standard CSS. So the top is top of my nav bar, right? So I'm saying there should be no space on the top and you stick there. There we go. And this is because there is no background, the text goes behind it. We can provide, for example, a background of very light color. There we go. You can play. There is also something like called box shadow. Then you can provide, for example, multiple values, right? So I want to say box shadow, say 10 pixel. I think this is the talks about axis. Let me just try this. I'll show you. So the first item talks about the offset of horizontal x-axis. The second one talks about the y-axis, so it goes 10 pixel this way and 10 pixel down. And then the color, there's another value which is the blur. There we go. There is one more that is the spread. There we go. So you can play with these numbers. Again, this is a shorthand for box shadow. You can apply multiple box shadows, but and you can play. You should always use a very subtle shadows. Don't use shadows like this. This is just absurd. But I don't want to use it for now. Just wanted to show you that there are possibilities to do it. And for the background of my buttons, I don't want that. And in fact, I want more paddings on the left and right than top and bottom. So remember, the first one is top and bottom, and then 10 pixel on the left and right. There we go. The background, for example, I want them to be some light blue. Sorry. I usually use hexadecimal values, but for this, I'm going to use this one. There we go. Maybe it's too much. Now it's RGB. Anywho, so that's one. So before we move on, I'm going to talk about this other selector. For example, sometimes, of course, when you hover over buttons, the color changes. That is the hover effect. It doesn't happen on our website. We can select the element we want to hover, which is the same thing, and then provide a colon, and then type the effect, the hover effect. And then what's going to happen when the hover happens? I want this RGB color, the blue, becomes darker like this. So now, bam, 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 right? Now this is called a pseudo selector because of this color. And again, if we go back to CSS selectors, we have pseudo class selectors and element selectors. And again, because there are just a lot of them, and most of them we don't even use them, most of them. So I'm not going to cover them on this video, all of them, at least the ones that we just use, like this hover. We use it a lot. So there are a lot of cool things you can do with CSS. For example, say I want to make my logo, which is that one, right? When I hover over that, so again, using the hover pseudo selector, I want to make the border radius, all of it, to be 10 pixels. So it kind of expands, right? Look. Now, this is snappy and not cool at all. What we can do on the element itself, not on the hover pseudo selector, right? On the element itself, we can provide a transition property and say this should cover all the transitions, right? So any sort of change, cover that. And it will ask for duration. I want to say 0.5 seconds. That's how you can provide it. And then say how it should be done. It should be easily in and out. It's much nicer, isn't it? There we go. So the other thing I want to talk about is these units, pixel, for example, or percentage, or so on. There is a category CSS units here, and there's a table. You can see we have absolute length units and relative units. So the absolute ones are like cm, millimeters, centimeters, inches, and so on, pixel, and they are always the same length regardless of the root element or the size of the screen. But the relative ones are relative to something. For example, the M unit is relative to the font size of the current font. The rem is relative to the font size of the root element. So if the root element, if I say in my body or in the pseudo selector or the universal selector, the font size is 16 pixel. Okay, so starting with a fixed or absolute unit, and then I come down here and say my H1 or paragraph should be 1 rem, sorry, font size 1 rem. That means 16 pixel. Now if I double it, you see, it is now 32 pixels. So it is relative to that font size in the root element. And there are all these other ones that I barely use them. I never use Vmax or Vmin. I use view height and view width, which is relative to the screen. Like the view width, 100% means the whole screen width, right? Or the view height. And by screen, I mean the window, the browser, not the monitor or the display. And like percentage is depending on the parent. So like if I say, for example, this P element that has a background of black, for example, or red, so we can see. So the width is 100%, right? By default, I want to say it's 90% now. There we go. So 90% of its parent, which is the body itself. So I think I'm almost towards the end. So with CSS, in fact, you can do a lot of things, okay? So for example, you can even write functions or do math calculations. For example, saying to take the width of the screen and then divide it by 2, or the subtract or or add to it. So it can be done by math functions. So I don't have anything that has a width, but if I, for example, say width should be, I think it's math, or is it caps? I don't remember, but you can actually provide a function. Or, you know, for example, you're using a color that is that you use it all the time. You can use something called like a values that you can use on your website. You see, there's a math function. Oh, it's calc, I'm sorry. So it's calc expression. But like I said, I never use these things. I don't use this at all because to me, you can achieve the same result with JavaScript a lot easier and better. Now, let me just wrap up a few things, just to wrap it up and also kind of summarize things. Again, W3 School's website is a very good reference. You can learn all about these properties and the values and how they're applied. And in many cases, you just don't know what to use. So you can Google, for example, you Google uh, box shadow or CSS box shadow. That's it. And a lot of results will come in. And W3 School is one of the very first ones. And we have a lot of concepts like the responsive design, which basically means your design should be, you know, responsive to the device the user is using. There are, you know, media queries, images, CSS grid, and pre-processors like this SAS. And that's why I personally say, if you know the basics of CSS, and that's fine. You don't need to get into the functions and all these and all that, because when you learn about CSS and you jump to pre-processors like SAS, you learn how easier and how better it is to use a pre-processor and let them do the work behind the scene because they translate it into CSS, right? So, but you still need to know the basics. And one of my favorite ways to use CSS, and I always use it in my own projects, I use Tailwind framework. This is a utility first CSS framework, and it's just, I love it. It's just very powerful. And to explain it, you know, with traditional CSS, you have to give the class name to your elements, and you go back and forth, and you can see how big, how repetitive, and how you know, difficult it is to maintain your CSS. However, with something like Tailwind, which is a utility class, or Bootstrap, you know, there are these other frameworks, Bootstrap, Tailwind, or I don't know, Material, I think. And what you do, although it is in line, although you have to write it in line, but it is a lot easier to maintain and style your page. And they're really good because they cover, you know, all the aspects that you might think. You know, they cover about the repetition. If you worry about repetition, there is a way to avoid it. They cover the responsive design, which is very easy with Tailwind. It is just absolutely, it's just very nice. I will make a video about Tailwind later. But I think that is much. This is it, guys, about CSS and what you can do with it and how to implement it. You only get better and better with practicing and playing around. I would really recommend just make an HTML, simple HTML file for yourself and just play around. I mean, play with the border, play with the box shadow, and the things you can come up with. And there's a lot you can do, even with an empty element. For example, like that box we created, you can have one element that there's nothing in it, but you make content with CSS. It's a very powerful language, and you can spend hours and hours and hours on it. So this is it, guys, and I hope I covered most of the important parts. And this is by no means a full tutorial. It's barely scratching the surface of CSS because there's a lot you can do, and you just have to play around. And so please make sure you like and subscribe. I hope you're enjoying these videos. Thanks for watching. See you at the next one. Bye.